We often think of the British motorcycle industry as kind of coming out of nowhere and having its day in the 60s with models like the Bonneville and the TR6, but in reality it started decades before with motorcycles like the Speed Twin and Thunderbird and T100, alongside of course BSA and Norton with their big singles. By the 1950s, companies like Triumph and BSA had already taken a nice chunk out of Harley's market share here in the States. These motorcycles were faster, lighter, and more technologically advanced, and they could be purchased for a fraction of what Harley's big twins cost. On the other side of the pond, this development of the best motorcycles in the world at this time, in Great Britain, really came out of absolute post-war necessity. But from where consumers here in America stood, with our post-war luxury, these were just awesome motorcycles unlike anything we'd seen come out of our own country, and we were ready to buy them. It wasn't as though Harley hadn't tried to make smaller, more affordable and economical bikes. The small single-cylinder Hummer filled that niche pretty well, but there was just way too big of a gap in their lineup between the small motorcycles and their big twins. And we can't overstate just how dire things were becoming for Harley, not just because of British competition, but also because of what was coming down the pipeline from Japan. And so Harley had to do something different. So in 1952, Harley responded with this, the Model K, a middleweight V-twin with a new redesigned 750cc unit construction engine. It had a hand clutch and a foot shifter. It was capable of over 100 miles per hour, and it was successful in racing. It had an all-new engine, plus it had telescopic forks and, holy cow, rear suspension. I mean, Elvis rode one. This was a pretty massive step in the right direction, right? Well, actually, the motorcycle still kind of sucked compared to the competition from overseas. It still made less power, and it weighed way more than something like the Thunderbird. And God forbid we compare it to something like what Vincent was making. That's just not fair. And the handling just wasn't there for the Model K. Also, it was still a side valve engine. Harley was still some 20 years behind the Brits at this point. Now that's not to say it wasn't a success for Harley, because it certainly was, but more importantly, it really laid the groundwork for what was to come, something far better. Enter the Sportster. Now you might look at the Model K and this new Sportster model and think that this was really just an updated version of that motorcycle, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Harley went back to the drawing board, starting with an entirely new up-to-date overhead valve engine known as the Ironhead. It's not that Harley hadn't done an overhead valve engine before. The EL or Knucklehead had come out some 20 years earlier and it was overhead valve, but this would be the single most advanced engine that they'd ever made. To compete with the Brits in power, Harley needed more revs, so they increased the bore and shortened the stroke over their previous K engine. This also made it possible to use larger valves, all of this leading to more revs and more power. Strangely enough, they chose not to go with an alloy head and instead gave it, you guessed it, an iron head. We don't really know why. I'm sure the reason was very Harley. Mainly it's probably that they knew that this was a safe option for them. They knew how to make iron heads and iron cylinders, and so that's what they did. In its 883cc form, it made a solid 40 horsepower, which was right on par with the popular new Triumph TR6 Trophy. Now, one of the primary goals with this motorcycle was to make it light, so a completely new frame was developed. It was more compact than Harley's bigger twins, making it significantly lighter and better and more nimble. Now, never mind the fact that the Sportster was still about 100 pounds more than that TR6. Weight isn't everything, but this motorcycle was never going to compete with a motorcycle like that out on the desert. The Sportster, though, was a truly modern motorcycle from Harley. Maybe not the best motorcycle in the world, especially when it was first released, but certainly ready to compete with the imports of its time. Now, like the Bonneville a few years later, this first generation of the Sportster, so to speak, isn't really the Sportster that we all think of when we think of this motorcycle, because it had so much of that old world style. It was so 1950s. Again, like the first year Bonneville, and so it was what the Sportster would develop into that would really make it the icon that it is today. As the 50s came to a close, it became clear that the Sportster was simply too slow as the Brits upped their twins to 650cc's, so the potential of this XL engine was realized and compression as well as valve size was massively increased in the H and CH models, and it's in these models that the Sportster really came into its own as a competitively priced, true sport bike with competitive specs, and finally, the Sportster would start to grow into its own hot rod name. Upping power was really the name of the game for Harley with the Sportster. They didn't really have a way to make the motorcycle as light as, the British bikes, so the way to beat them was to just make more power than them. Now, that first generation, so to speak, of the Sportster was styled far too much like the older Model K, and it just didn't match its own improving performance, and so the iconic stripped-down XLCH would pave the way not only for the Sportster in terms of performance, but also in terms of its styling going forward, despite the fact that the initial XLCH wasn't even road legal in its initial form. The parallels between what Harley and Triumph did with their standout motorcycles from this era are so interesting. The Bonneville initially was too old school, and so the stripped down TR6 styling would essentially take over and become the styling for the Bonneville. And this is the same with the Sportster. The initial styling was too big and curvy and just old world 50s, and so the stripped down, almost scrambler-like XLCH would become just kind of the standard style for the Sportster. In 1962, Cycle World would call the Sportster the fastest motorcycle they'd ever tested. Some would say they should have tested more motorcycles, but hey, it was incredibly powerful. It was finally right there on par with the imports, and it looked damn good. And of course, the Sportster at this point would begin to breed an entire scene of customization and hot rodding and choppers in America, and it's so influential that by the end, both the British and Japanese manufacturers found themselves scrambling to make their motorcycles look, well, like Sportsters. And the entire Japanese cruiser phenomenon was thanks to this motorcycle. Power continued to increase, thanks especially to larger valves as the 60s carried on. By 1965, the XLCH Sportster was tested at 55 horsepower, which is significantly higher than pretty much all of the other mass-produced bikes in this class. If you're wanting to get a Sportster, many would say that these late 60s models before AMF bought Harley is really the place to go. Now, these models had more power, better oiling, and more displacement, and that helped keep the Sportster name right there among the likes of the Bonneville and later the Norton Commando, and of course the oncoming Honda CB750. Also, can we just appreciate the incredible sound of the Ironhead engine? It wouldn't be too long after the Sportster really got going that their overhead valve engine would once again become out of date when Honda released the incredible overhead cam CB750, a motorcycle that would single-handedly wipe out the British motorcycle industry. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but only a bit of an exaggeration. There were certainly other factors, but man, it doesn't help when your traditional pizza restaurant is struggling and suddenly the best wood-fire pizza place in the world opens right next to your establishment. As much as Harley would continue to update the Sportster, they couldn't compete on paper with what Honda and other Japanese manufacturers could now offer, and though they did go through serious financial struggles, especially during the dark AMF years, the Japanese invasion didn't kill Harley or the Sportster the way that it did the British industry. But why is this the case? This is one of the great mysteries of motorcycle history. Why is it that Harley was able to survive, being even more traditional than the British bikes and arguably just as unreliable? The Sportster's 60-year life really gives us a clear look into what this motorcycle was all about and what Harley was trying to accomplish with it. And its survival, as the big British bikes went from being on top of the world to completely dead in a matter of a few years thanks to the Japanese offerings, the Sportster just carried on. Even when Harley left the shovelhead for the Evo platform in the 80s, they just kept making overhead valve engines. Meanwhile, the Japanese manufacturers had been making high-revving 4s for over a decade, to the point where, at this point in the 80s when the Evo engine was released, the biggest, fastest Japanese motorcycles were just completely different and doing a completely different thing than what Harley was doing with the Sportster. But there was never a moment where Harley considered turning the Sportster into, say, a sport bike or an adventure bike. It just stayed the same as the world around it moved forward. Now, as the popularity of high-revving fours has waned over the past decades, I wonder if we've been looking at this whole thing backwards. Perhaps the Sportster was trying to tell us something that we are just now starting to understand. More revs and even more horsepower doesn't always equal more fun. Sportster and Harley riders in general have always known this, and with the new popularity of the V format, both V4s and V-twins, maybe Harley's grumbly, torquey motorcycles were oddly ahead of the game. Regardless, when you look at the Sportster and its evolution, no pun intended, you see a motorcycle coming from a manufacturer in Harley that's not exactly playing the same game as everyone else. From British roadsters to Japanese touring bikes and sport bikes, Italian race bikes, all of these things have come along, and the motorcycle industry has changed so much since the Sportster first came out, and all along through history, there's just old Harley just doing what they do, and still selling tons of expensive motorcycles. Though the model name for this motorcycle was XL, upon its release, Harley had just recently moved from only labeling their models with simple letters to now having motorcycles called the Hydroglide and Hummer. But for this motorcycle, they managed to give it one of the single coolest names in motorcycle history, right up there with Fireblade, Sportster. This name would really define what Harley was trying to do and what they would continue to do with this bike going forward. It wasn't and never would be a full-blown sport bike. It had way too much Harley DNA to be that. It was a sporty roadster, a Sportster. It was a cruiser, a middle ground between Harley's big touring bikes and what the Brits were offering. A bike that's powerful, yes, and fast, of course, but more than anything, just fun for cruising and riding, and it's just cool. It would be a motorcycle that, like so many of Harley's motorcycles, gave the illusion of power and speed with its raw sound and visceral feel. If the big British twins were like a nice pint and the Japanese fours maybe a fine wine, the Sportster was like a shot of whiskey. Not necessarily the smartest path to inebriation, but it'll sure get you there and you might end up in a bar fight at the end. And in the 60s and 70s, and even today, that's exactly what a lot of American riders want. The Sportster would really exist as a symbol for Harley's entire business model. In a thoroughly American way, they would just continue to consistently make do with what they had and stay competitive in their own weird way. Even as the British industry fell off, the Sportster just carried on. And what made this motorcycle great and really kept the company afloat is that it was still the company's own. It wasn't a full-on attempt at copying the Brits or the Japanese or anybody. It was still so thoroughly Harley, and that made it unique through its long run. In essence, up until a few years ago, the Sportster's basic DNA and form remained almost entirely the same, while most of the other manufacturers moved to overhead cam and high-revving multi-cylinder machines. Harley just kept rumbling along with their trusty V-twins. As much as the Sportster was a new kind of motorcycle upon its release, a motorcycle that kept them alive amidst foreign competition, in the end, it's the way the Sportster managed to continue Harley's heritage that actually made it competitive. Another way to put it would be that it's the way the Sportster stood out, not fit in or copied other bikes, that made it truly great. It's no secret that Harley faces a similar dilemma today as they did in the 50s and 60s, with many of their riders leaving the brand for cheaper, smaller, and often categorically better motorcycles. But I think the dialogue around Harley's future can be a bit misguided. Often the dichotomy for Harley's path forward is either to stick to their heritage or move beyond their heritage into the future. I really think that the Sportster and its long history is a helpful guide for this discussion in moving beyond the heritage versus future argument. The Sportster was both. It was a thoroughly Harley motorcycle, appealing to those who wanted a Harley or wanted something unique and thoroughly American, but it was a capable, usable street bike. It was at one time Harley's bread and butter and really their moneymaker, despite slowly becoming something of a relic. I would argue that today, Harley, with models like the new Sportster S, are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to do both, to point back to their heritage while moving forward, like they did in the 50s with the Sportster. Whether they're succeeding, I think that's up for debate. A few years back, before my dad knew about my obsession with British bikes, if I told him that I was gonna get a motorcycle, he would have immediately asked if it was a Sportster. Here in many parts of America, and especially, in the Midwest, Sportster is basically synonymous with motorcycle. It's like the F-150 of two-wheeled machines. F-150 equals truck. Sportster equals motorcycle, and I think that's pretty cool. In digging in and learning about the Sportster's history, many sources were used for this video, but I want to shout out one in particular, which is a YouTuber named Chris of the OT. He makes really awesome content, and in particular, this historical video series on the Sportster. So I've linked part 1 below. If you guys want to dig in deeper and check that out, it's still ongoing. And if you guys like, detailed motorcycle history videos, check out his channel. And lastly, I have zero doubt that many of you have owned and ridden Sportsters, so let us know your thoughts and experiences on the bike in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video. Ride safe.